All right. Thanks for being here. Antonio Iannella, writer, musician, business owner, other things I'm sure we'll talk about. How does songwriting affect your prose writing?
It gave me a foundation on how to put words together. And with my songwriting, I always try to be a little bit cryptic and use lyrics that may not necessarily describe exactly what the song is about, but some way have some link that sort of pulls it all together. So when I was writing my book, that's kind of the approach I took, was just to find prose that kind of told a story, but not always directly.
Did you start songwriting before you started book writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been writing songs for about 30 odd years, and then the book writing sort of appeared about 12 years ago.
Okay. Do you find that the calling to do that, or the time where you feel the impulse to write versus prose is a specific time during the day, or how do you get into the mood of each one of those?
Sure. It usually begins with an inspiration, but I often separate the two. If I'm working on let's say, a band project, my attention is focused around that. And so I'll wake in the morning and I might have some ideas and just sit at the piano over to my left, or to my right, I should say, and just tinker about and play stuff and write lyrics. But then when I'm in the book writing phase, I just focus on that. It's just attention is all dedicated to writing. So they're separate, completely separate, but somehow tied together.
With the book writing, do you schedule a time to do it and say, I'm going to try to finish this section of it, or write for a word count, or write for a time? Or how do you make way through a project?
Yeah, I have quite a strong discipline to write each day and not rely on motivation, because I find motivation can let you down. So I have that mindset of get on with it, action before motivation, and I find then the motivation follows. And during the writing of the book, I was blocking out like 4 hours a day, and I'd go to the library, so I'm away from home, away from distraction, and just go to the library and lock into the laptop and just punch out words. And I set targets, like I'd say, okay, it's Monday, by Friday I want to have this chapter finished. And then I'd do little things like reward myself when I'd hit that target. Go out for a walk in nature, or shout myself some lunch or get a coffee. Small rewards just to acknowledge that achievement.
Is there something you can do differently to get into the mood for writing books versus music or songs?
I often, when I go out on my daily walks with my dog, I tend to just let my imagination flow, and that's where it begins. That's kind of the trigger. I'll come up with maybe a lyric or a verse, or I'll hear something that triggers an idea, or I might have a passage of text that I've come up with that, and I might just note it in my phone and then come home and build it into a story. So yeah, it often the ideas flow when I'm away from the source, like I'm away from the piano, away from the laptop, could be driving, and I'm not consciously thinking about it, and ideas pop into my head.
Where do you think ideas come from?
It's from the universe. It channels through me. I don't know. I've written this short story, and I call it The Melody Lord. And the Melody Lord exists in Melody Heaven, and he comes down at night and whispers melodies into my ear while I'm asleep. And it's my job to turn those melodies into songs. And I'm like the melody messenger. And that's the same with the writing. It just channels through me. And while I was developing the skill of writing, especially with this book, it was just letting go of what I thought how you should write. or how there's trying to follow any structure. I just let it go and followed any crazy idea I had and just went on a journey and it built from there and just kept building and building. And like I said, taking ideas that describe something that's completely not related to the story but it tells a story that somehow describes what I'm trying to talk, what I'm saying. So, yeah.
Yeah, that subconscious working on those thoughts seems to get things straight at the end. I don't know if it's your subconscious saying this is going to meet there, or if it's your subconscious saying you're thinking over here and now we got to bring it back over to this section. But yeah, I get that.
It's getting into that flow state. It's like a whole brain thinking where you're able to, like you said, you're able to marry these crazy ideas you have and pull them together and somehow they meet. And it's in that flow state. You need to be in that space where your mind is just completely free from outside distraction and you can just channel into that idea and build it.
Yeah, that's the mystifying part of writing to me, is that I think the big difference between a writer and not a writer is you have to write. So it's when you get those ideas when you're standing in line somewhere or in the middle of the night or in the shower or whenever, you have to not only understand that that's something, but then write it down. So
exactly.
You write that down, and it used to be on notepads everywhere, and now it's in the phone mainly. And you get your notes together there and then come back to it later. But I think you have to be open to hear it and then do something to save it. Otherwise, it's just floating around in the ether for someone else, I guess.
Yeah, spot on, mate. TJ, spot on. That's, like you said about, it used to be notepads lying around the house, but now it's your phone. And I'll be driving, for example, and if I'm in that state where I'm writing songs, I'll be driving, and when you hear it, there's another car that drives by and they've got their radio or stereo on quite loud, and you just hear a flash of that beat, as it passes. And sometimes that might just trigger an idea and create a melody, and I'll pull over and just sing that basic melody into my phone, record it, and then when I get home, I just sit at the piano and develop it into a song, build lyrics. So you just got to be open to understand that there's something there that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, for me, poetry and songwriting are similar, but I can tell the difference in them when you get that first little message of it and you start writing it down and you go, well, this sounds like a song. This sounds like poetry. This sounds like a line that somebody would say in a story you've been thinking about. And how do you keep those? Number one, why do you think that is? How can you tell the difference when you first get the idea, the feeling of it? How do you keep that straight?
Okay. I generally, for me, and songwriting, poetry, writing, everyone has a different way of developing their ideas. But for me, it generally begins at the music. I may have a songwriting idea. The best way to describe it is through how I wrote a particular song. A few years ago, I was going through some mental health issues, and my GP diagnosed me with depression, and I was in a bit of a state of denial and thinking, I'm not depressed, I'm just going through a bit of a hard time. And I was driving back from my doctor's, and I thought and I was having that conversation with myself, and I thought, it's like an invisible wall. And so that's where the idea began, with that thought, invisible wall. And then I sat at the piano and just started tinkering about and building a melody or a chord structure around that idea and just humming that lyric until I had something. So it always began at the music, which enabled me to take some kind of lyric and build it into that piano line. Whereas, another example is Elton John and Bernie Taupin, I think his last name is, who wrote all those classic songs. And Bernie wrote all the lyrics in poetry form, and then Elton John turned them into songs. And if you actually sit there and listen to how the melody or how those lyrics are structured, you can hear that I can hear that they began as poetry. So that, yeah, I just find that for me, it's melodic, but then, and you can almost separate the two, because I find that writing melodies or lyrics attached to melodies, it's kind of, it phrases the lines a little bit different. So therefore you're playing on words a little bit differently, and you're able to change a syllable and stretch out that particular word in order to fit into the melody. Whereas poetry, you kind of read it a little bit more as it's read or as it's written. So if that makes any sense.
It does. Do you visualize then, or understand, or think about the origin of where the poetry comes from versus music? Like if you have the melody that comes to you, and do you think the source of poetry is somewhere else, and just like the source of prose is somewhere else? How do you visualize those?
I find they're connected. I find the melody. If I have a lyrical idea and I sit at the piano to develop that idea, the tone of what I'm playing will reflect what the lyric is trying to say. And I mean by the mood, whether it's a minor chord or it's a major chord, and how I build it from there. So they're often tied together. Like that song I was giving you the example with, Invisible War. It was kind of, it's not necessarily an uplifting song, but it's about depression. So I found that the chords and the melody had to reflect that, and so they're tied together for me. And the origin, it always comes from something I'm feeling, or something someone has said, or something that they are going through and they've expressed. I've written many songs. Another example was I was with a friend one night, and they were describing to me how they just split up with their boyfriend, and she was saying, "Oh, I'm done. That's it. No more." And I go, "Just relax. Take your time. Better luck next time." And I just thought, better luck next time. And I kept that lyric in my head. When I got home, I turned it into a song. And it was based around her experience.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because you write that one little phrase down. And when I write notes, I started some years ago, where I'd write the date and the time that I got it. If it's poetry, that's what I put the date and the time. If it's just something from a book or a line from a book, then I might not put a date on it, because poetry for me is different than prose for some reason. I feel like it comes from a different place.
Okay, interesting.
And you can write that down and then think, I'm never going to remember all those feelings of it. And I used to do the words or the line and then a couple ideas about it, but then you end up typing a lot. So that's okay. But I found also that you can put that note in there, and while you might not ever remember that note was there, you go back scrolling through all these notes, because you have to organize them somehow. And you're like, oh man, I got 20 pages of notes here in my phone. And you find that, and you go, you read the line, and then you remember everything that you were thinking about. I haven't had it yet happen to where I couldn't recall those feelings I had when I wrote that note down. So that's surprising to me. And I wonder if that's just because writing and remembering and thinking is like a muscle, and the more you do it, the better you get at it, or stronger you get at it, or whatever. That it started with writing those feelings down and those ideas attached to the line, but then it became not so necessary to do it. So you can, write the line down, go on about what you were doing, and then pick it up later.
Do you find that you try to keep completely authentic or honest to the initial idea, or do you allow it to go in any direction?
I think once you have it done, like you've written the poem or a song that it takes on a life of its own. So I'm very
Okay, yeah,
careful about going back to change it. But I have written things where I can look at it from a different perspective years later and go, wow, I remember what I was thinking about when I first wrote it. And now it means something different to me. I think that's the great part about that is somebody else could read it and get something totally different from it too. And it makes me think about the movie The Drummer with the guy that played Dwight Schrute off The Office and the American version of The Office. And anyway, he's a drummer. The kid, he's older, and there's kids. Have you
yeah.
seen the
Great,
movie?
great
Okay,
film, great film.
so it
Love it.
has the I'm not bitter, and it's a really slow song that the kid wrote, and then he's like, no, how about you? Maybe the original title was I'm bitter, and then the drummer guy goes, well, how about we flip that around, speed it up, and change the lyrics to I'm not bitter, and make it more of a happy song, upbeat song.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
interesting that you can flip something around like that. But I think that goes to the authenticity of the writing, to where if it has a continuity one way, it's going to have it the other if you flip it over.
sure, yeah. But with if you were to, you can apply that to music as well. Often you hear a song that was written and performed by the original band in a certain fashion where it's upbeat, and then someone takes it and breaks it down and turns it into more of a love song, and it the mood is completely different, takes on a different dimension. So yeah, it's just playing around those ideas, and that's real. I really enjoy that. I like that
Yeah.
component
I
of
do listen
performing arts.
to songs sometimes and go, man, why would they write the song like that? Why wouldn't they change this word to that and not
Yeah,
rhyme this word with the same word in the next line? Just put a little
yeah,
bit more thought into it. I mean, maybe that's just me looking at it from a perspective and not, I feel like it's sloppy and rushed, but it's obviously something I'm listening to. So there's some reason I'm listening to it. And if I care to listen to it that much, then obviously it's striking a chord somewhere. But there's one song I can think of called "All It Takes" or something. I think it's that, and the lyric is, "I'm going to give it all it takes till I reach the top." And I go, whoa, why would you stop giving all it took after you reach the top? Then you're not going to be at the top very long. So why
yeah,
not
yeah,
just change it to, "I'm going to give it all it takes, and then I'll reach the top," or change it to something else, and then keep
yeah.
that message going.
I think there is probably quite a bit of laziness in songwriting because maybe some artists don't focus on the lyrical content as
Mm.
much. Let's say, for example, Bob Dylan, who is just so lyrical and there's always a message, whereas other artists, it's not that important.
Yeah, I was listening to a interview with Kurt Cobain that they say is one of the last interviews with him, and he's talking about songwriting, and the interviewer was asking him where he got his ideas for writing, and he talked about a book or a story he read and how he turned that into a song. And then he said towards he used to, I'm not sure if he's separating it into like the power chord music he was doing, and then they were going to go on and do some other type of music, but he's like, I was just getting, I was running out of ideas, and I understand what that means. And then he goes, I was just writing down anything, any garbage, and then I'd have to explain what it meant later when I don't know what it meant. So to me, that makes me think, is that lazy, or is that just being so connected as the conduit to creativity that you come out with a great song that you think is doesn't make any sense, and you don't know how to explain it, but you can explain it later on, and it's obviously hitting some nerves with people that they understand it and get a message from it. So I don't know. I tend to think of that as not garbage, but just maybe not understood from the origin of it. Like the poetry I write, you could easily say, what does that mean? But as you were talking about before, where you try to keep the lyrics a little more mysterious, that I like that, because I think it does open it up to different meanings. Plus, it's also feels like that's the message I'm getting. So that's what I write versus me pushing the poem. Like I can tell when it's just me writing a poem because it's not, I don't like it as much. But when you get into that zone and you're acting as the conduit or creativity is manifesting somehow and you end up with this thing that you can sit back and read and go, wow, where did that come from? That's, man, that's pretty good. And it doesn't matter to me what anybody else says about it. I'm still like, wow, that's pretty good. I'm the instrument, not the hand on that.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing to achieve when you're creating is to feel that way. And just it's really about the process rather than the outcome. And then you can at least say at the end, this is I've been authentic. This is my true self who's written this. And you can be objective, but you can also be just proud of what you've achieved, regardless of what others think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if proud is the right word. I think I would say more of thankful to be a part of it, maybe pleased with it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Proud is a weird word for me on explaining any of that, but it's it's more grateful and mystified, I think, than anything.
Sure. Okay.
When you started doing the music stuff, when did you get the idea of you wanted to have a recording studio?
It actually, when I was in my teens, it began there. I wanted to work in studios as a teenager, and back then it was called audio engineering, which you don't hear that title anymore. So that was my interest. And over the years as a muso, I've also always had some kind of recording gear, 8 tracks, 4 tracks, drum machines. And then I remember back in the 80s or was it the 90s when the first Atari was used, the Atari 64 was used to record on, but not audio recording. It was through MIDI transfer. So I began there and just built from there. I've always had that interest in audio, and then did some courses and just got right into it. And then eventually, like 10 years ago, I just decided it was when I made that album with the band project, the Lion Tamers. At the time, I wanted to record that project in my own studio because I had the previous project we had recorded in a pretty high-end recording studio here in Melbourne, and I just wasn't pleased with the result. It just felt like it was a bit rushed, and I wasn't tinkering about with the ideas and building parts. It was just the band went in and we recorded it, and that's how it came out. Whereas with this, when I created the Lion Tamers, I wanted to just be able to build the songs from scratch and get demos recorded. Okay, that middle section needs another part, that needs this, and be a bit more objective, take a step back and listen to the development. So, and that was only going to happen with my own recording studio. So that's where it began. I put together, and in fact, the studio was set up in this space, and we were recording in here, and I had the microphone where all the recording was done was in another room, and we punched cables through the wall and padded out the room. And then I actually, about 7 or 8 years ago, I converted my garage into a proper recording studio. So it's been a slow unfold over many, many years.
Yeah, I remember recording things on just a regular tape recorder where my dad had an old reel-to-reel and we used that sometimes, but the tape was so expensive that we were just into the cassette stuff, and you would have one microphone and you press, play and record to record, and it was difficult to layer tracks. And then we had a friend that had a 3-track machine, and that was just magic. And then look at things now like GarageBand and all the things you can get on your computer, and it's like, wow, what would I have done if I had that when I was a kid versus, think of all the ridiculous recordings I would have from being a kid now to send through that and sample and master and all that. So
it's
recording studio.
it's really exciting where it's at, but it's also there's just so much. It's like there's too many choices. The paradox of choice. There's just so many choices of, and you get stuck on deciding. Like now, you could just, if I'm building a drum track, I can select from a library of 30 snares, and you'd be there going, okay, you click and grab that snare and drop it into the track and go, okay, that's not right. And sometimes you're there for hours and hours just trying to build a basic snare sound. So the magic of that spontaneous, 4 or 5 people in a room recording all at the same time, it's been lost a little bit. But the beauty of being able to create things on your own, on your laptop, it's just incredible. And how you can just download up, you might need a sound and you go, okay, you just find it somewhere and you download it and incorporate it into the music. Whereas once upon a time, they were probably, for example, that recording the Pink Floyd track, Time, where at the beginning there's all those clocks and that have been chopped up, and apparently that took hours for the audio clerk to chop up all the tape and stick it together to make that little piece. And it took him days to do that. You could probably do that in a couple of hours now on your laptop, on your computer. So,
wow. How much of the older equipment do you keep in your studio just for either getting the old sound like a tube amp, or is it not worth keeping all that stuff around?
I still have my old tape 8-track recorder, but when I'm working with clients, I don't use it. I just stick with recording on my computer and through Pro Tools and microphones. And I have like an old valve preamp that helps with the warming up the sound. But with the 8-track, I use that. For example, during COVID, I pulled out the 8-track and loaded up an old cassette of recordings I did in a band when I was in London, going back 20 odd years ago, and contacted the guys. And we had a whole bunch of incomplete tracks. And I just contacted the 3 or 4 members and said, hey, let's work on this during COVID. We're all stuck at home. Let's do something. So I recreated with the 8-track. I fed all the individual tracks. Let's say track 1 was drums, track 2 was bass guitar, 3 vocals, 4 guitar, etc., etc. So I converted all those single tracks into my computer one at a time, from tape to digital, and then spent days and days trying to line it all up, because it was the tape would slow down and speed up, and the click track on the computer, it doesn't play with time. It's just dead straight, click, click, click. So I had to then chop up all the individual tracks and line them up with the beat. And then I sent the files to the boys in the UK. The bass player did his parts, the vocalist did some parts, the drummer did some bits. They sent me the files and reconstructed it. So I did that using the old 8-track, and I just can't throw it out. It's still sitting in my studio there, and occasionally I'll find an old recording and convert it into a new song.
Yeah, I think the 3-track that we were using was a Tascam or something like that. That was just, yeah. And then you look at the studios that have all the knobs and everything now. Is that what a current studio would have, or is it just all on a computer?
No, the bigger studios combine both, have the big console with all the knobs, and now they're digitalized, so it's all connected to the computer. But in my studio, I mainly work in the box, meaning in the computer. I'm going to have like an outboard mixer that helps with just the monitoring sound. But most smaller studios are working primarily in their computer, and having all the plugins and apps that alter sound and manipulate sounds. But bigger studios are combining the two.
Nice. So then the music studio, you're using that all the time then?
I go through phases, subject to what I'm working on. Because I've been working on the book the last 3 or 4 months, a bit longer than that, but a lot of my attention's been focused on the book. And then doing sessions in between that, like for example, I have a session tomorrow, but I'm not working on any of my own material with one of my sort of band projects that I've got going. I've just parked that while I've been focusing on the book, and I'll just return to that at some point, pick it up. And the people I work with, it's very relaxed, and it's like, hey, let's do another song. I've got this idea, and then we build it from there. But yeah, currently it's mostly book work.
How long ago did you start the book?
It began, the initial beginnings of the writing was 12 years ago. In 2012-ish is where I began writing. And then it just took a long time to get to this point. There was a big break in between when I began working on The Lion Tamers. And then it sort of sat on my hard drive doing nothing for about 5 years. And then just picked it up again through COVID. We just itching to find something to do, and hey, that was a great opportunity to get started again, get back into it. And the first thing I did was I took a chapter out of the book, like the 14th chapter, and I turned it into a short story, and I entered that into a local writing competition and received a 3rd prize. And that just gave me the inspiration. I felt like I've got it now. Now I've just got to apply that to what I had and sort of rewrite it and restructure it and redraft it.
What program are you using to do most of your writing?
Yeah, just Word. Just Word. And then if I need stuff done to get it to print form, I employed someone who I hired a guy to just put all the files together so it's ready to go to print.
Do you do a lot of pre-writing or planning before you start writing? How did you approach?
I didn't really do much well, it wasn't pre-writing, it was just writing, get into it and write, and then drafting, rewriting, and then parking it aside for many months. That's a really good skill to have, is to, not a skill, but to apply that idea of separating yourself from the story and then revisiting it, I don't know, 6 months later, just to see how it feels. So that break of 5 years from the book was just absolutely required, because it enabled me to be a lot more objective. And there's a lot of stuff that just didn't work, and so I just tossed it out and rewrote. But yeah, like songwriting, a lot of the ideas were just from bullet points, and build those bullet points, and those bullet points would appear when I'm out for a walk or driving, and then yeah. So that was the planning, was just coming up with the ideas and then building the ideas.
While the story or the book was set aside for the 5 years, were you writing other things?
Occasional poems, but mostly lyrics and music. Because I had the studio, it was all about recording. I spent a lot of time producing. I was working with other artists and still do that. And then, yeah, because the band project was a 3-piece. So it was myself playing piano keys and 2 vocalists, and they played guitar. So everything else had to be done, like all the drum parts I built through drum samples and created rhythms, and so that was done. A lot of the bass stuff was done. The singer played bass, so I had to sort of engineer the whole thing. So that took a lot of time, and I was learning the process as well, learning how to use the software and learning how to get the best sounds out of it. Like I was saying before, out of a snare drum or a kick drum, and how to record vocals. So it just absorbed me.
Yeah, I found that in the day of the technology with all those choices, it's good to find a program that you like initially and then learn how to use that rather than switch around to a whole bunch of different things. Even in video editing and music editing, all that, even with writing, like I've tried a few things that weren't Word to write in, and then I just always come back to Word just because I think it's closest to writing on paper. Like it's simple. You don't have all those other tabs that come up, and here's the backstory for this character, here's this arc, here's this thing. You end up doing a lot more writing than that's the outside of what the finished product's going to be. And I think to a person that writes a book, there's always a larger story that other people won't know. But have you written, have you, do you have a goal to write more fiction or nonfiction, or what do you think your calling is on that?
I think I have been thinking of writing some fiction. I've got a couple of story ideas. I've also thinking about writing a children's book, like a fable, with some really nice illustration. That's one idea. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I'll go down the nonfiction path again. I think I've said everything I've wanted to say in this book. Yeah, so I've got a few other ideas.
Have you done collaborative book writing with anyone or story writing? I mean, music is obviously highly collaborative, but have you done any other
No,
collaborations?
I haven't. I haven't done that. I was in the early stages of writing the book. I was in a creative writing group that ran from the library, and a lot of people. The idea of the group was we'd submit a chapter, and everyone would critique it, and then you're able to take those ideas and those critiques home and apply some of them, the ones you wanted to the story. But there wasn't really one of the guys would help with some of structuring some of my paragraphs and sort of helping me conclude a short story. But that's about it. Didn't really to do any shared writing or collaborative writing.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people, especially the famous writers, that say in order to write well, you have to read a lot. And I'm not sure what a lot is, but I read a fair amount, but probably not what people would call a lot. So I think
Yeah.
you were talking about it before, where you're just trying to get your voice or the tone that you want to write and then go with that, as long as it's understandable to people and you're happy enough, satisfactory enough of how it's come out, then I think that's a success. But how do you categorize or consider, what do you consider success in all your different types of writing, or what other people write? Like here's an example for poetry. I think that if you write a poetry book and you have 100 poems in it and somebody reads it and they like one poem, I think that's a success. Because when I read Whitman Leaves of Grass, which has a lot of poems in it, and I can think of one I really like and maybe another one that I would revisit every now and then, but I there's no, I mean, Whitman's a classic, but
Yeah.
I don't mind reading them, but there's one that "Oh Mio Life" is, I think, a great poem, and I really like the message, and
Yeah.
so I consider it a success. And even if you wrote a whole poetry book and nobody knew any of the poems, like they wouldn't call any of them remarkable, but then they would say there's one or two lines that they like, then I think that's probably a success too. It might be different with writing a novel as to how I would gauge the success, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think, yeah, well, for your description, it kind of would remind me of like an album where there'd be two or three hit songs that capture people's attention, and then the rest are just songs. And they're not bad or good or bad, but they're just part of the album. And that would go with poetry. But for me, writing my book, because it's a memoir, it needed to have a flow and it needed to have a voice because it's my personal story. So they were key, and everything else, obviously, grammar, structure, character building, dialogue, that all had to be in there and correct. But I also had to let go of those, I guess, those boundaries that sometimes we put on ourselves. I had to just write and get out what I was trying to say and making it entertaining, and then seeing what's coming back through other people, because you can be a little bit too much in your own story and not able to see how others are perceiving it. So I began to sort of share a few chapters and just get people's vibe on what they were feeling. And then if something struck a chord with someone, like for example, there was one of the critiques I had from the writing group was how they liked how I used narrative in between the dialogue. So I'd have the dialogue and then my thoughts being the narrative in between the dialogue, and they really liked how that portrayed. So I've made that a key component throughout the book, that not only having dialogue, there'd also be narrative and prose in between. And yeah, so just finding those things that tie it all together and become a thread, and also focusing on a way that draws the reader into the story, and so they feel like they are part of it. So reading it is becomes very visual for them, and those are some of the things I try to develop.
Yeah, I think all of that is why people say in order to write well, you have to read a lot, because you have to be able to see what you enjoy reading, what type of, not the content, but how it's delivered, of how much narrative versus dialogue, how's it set up on the page, how you
Yeah,
do quotes, how you format it, all those things that
yeah,
you don't want to come out with something that's difficult for someone to read. Like, are you going to use a 12 font? Are you going to do it small? What are your borders going to be? All of that is just noise to the story that's on the page. So,
yeah,
yeah, I can see
yeah,
the advantage of looking at a lot of examples and understanding it. And that's also, I think, why you get better at writing the more you
sure,
do it,
yeah,
is because, especially if you have some input from someone else and it's not just you writing it and nobody else ever seeing it. So at what point did you start showing or sharing chapters with it with other people? At like the third or fourth draft, or how many times?
It was literally, it began, like I said, in 2012. The first few drafts, or the first draft, I began to submit into the writing group, and I wasn't getting very good feedback. I was getting, you've got a great story, but you haven't, it's not told very well, because you know how you hear, everyone has a book in them. You hear that people say, oh, everyone's got a book in them, you should write a book. But writing the book is one component, but telling the story is something completely different. You need to be able to tell a story. So I had a story, but I just wasn't able to, I hadn't found a way to tell it yet. So then I took their advice, which was read a lot, find your own voice, and work out how you want to tell your story. So that's what I focused on, and I did. I read a lot, and I got some ideas, and I found what appealed to me was how people were able to tell a story and make you feel like you're part of that story, and you're witnessing it rather than just reading about it. So they're the things I began to incorporate. But it was the first few drafts that were read through the writing group that were critiqued, and then I, through those pretty not very good review critiques, it enabled me to push harder and learn more.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to get somebody to read it or parts of it while it's not yet fully formed. I don't know
Yeah,
if you just write a paragraph and then show it to somebody like a writing assignment. I think you got to put a little more thought into it. But in the beginning part, it helps, because if you were to go through it all, do 12 drafts by yourself, and then show it to someone as a finished product,
yeah,
and then they said, "Whoa, why didn't you do it this way?" Or "This is hard to understand," then
yeah,
it might be something you set aside and never go back to, just because it seems so daunting.
yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah, my first draft, it was very daunting. I got to about 7 chapters when I first let someone read the first few chapters, and it was it was an eye opener. I was like, I'm not enjoying your story. It needs to be this, this, and that. So luckily, I didn't get to the end, but I just actually tossed all that. And then from that advice, I wrote the first opening prologue to the book. And once I wrote that and I submitted that into the writing group, they all loved it. And somehow I just was able to turn the whole writing around. I was able to find my voice, tell a story that was entertaining, but had some kind of, I guess, comic value to it. And then once I did that, I knew I was on the path, and I just kept writing and kept writing.
Yeah, get the recipe right. What's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
um
That's it.
what's the best way for people to follow your work and
Okay.
get copies of your book?
All right. So the book was that's the book. It's called Saigon Siren. It's a memoir about my stroke recovery. The stroke happened in Vietnam while I was on a family holiday in 2009. And the reason the book is called Saigon Siren is because when I collapsed, I was rushed to hospital in an ambulance, but my vague memory I don't remember there being a siren. And we were rushed from a little village to Saigon. And Saigon, after the Vietnam War, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. So I just took the two words Saigon, which doesn't exist anymore, the name doesn't exist, and Siren, which didn't exist, and I put them together and come up with the title, Saigon Siren, Memoir of a Stroke Recovery. And the best place to find it, if you're interested in looking, the easiest way is to Google Saigon Siren, and from there you will find links to my website. And on my website, you'll be able to hear all my music that I've recorded over the years. You'll be able to visit the studio page, see footage that while in Vietnam and band photos. And I've tried to build a very immersive website where it's all contained and you're able to get a feel and you're able to read some sample chapters and excerpts and snippets and title together. There's links to Amazon where you can order the book if that's what you're wanting to do. And you can even email me. There's a contact page and I'm happy to answer any questions or, have a chat.
Excellent. I'll have in the show notes is your website and a link to your website and also to Amazon to where your book is. So that's there for anybody that wants to check it out. Any thoughts you have in closing? Anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't?
Not specifically, but just and I'm happy with people wanting to visit my website. Like I said, there's plenty of stuff on there. I've tried to build a very immersive website that when people read the book, they can visit the website and tie it all together and get a broader understanding of the journey. And it's also it's partly a project of hope, and I'm trying to encourage people to be hopeful and sort of apply, I guess, purpose to their lives. We're often challenged with what's going on in the world, and sometimes purpose helps you step outside that and just enjoy the present moment. And that's what the journey is about. So I'm just trying to encourage that.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. And like I said, the links are in the show notes, and I'll talk to you on the other side of this musical exit.
Cheers. Thanks, TJ. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.